Hi everyone, I'm Nicola Wass. I'm the Chief Executive of SOMO, a behavioural science consultancy based in the northwest of England. And today I'm here with Dr. Holly Hope Smith, our Head of Behavioural Science, and sending a regretful wave from Andy Codd, the Road Safety Coordinator from Liverpool City Council, who would have liked to join us, but unfortunately was unable. So we're taking over his bits in this presentation. So between me and Holly, we're going to tell you how Liverpool Council's working with SOMO to reduce the number of people who are killed or seriously injured on their roads every year. Now, this is the first time Liverpool City Council road safety team have worked using a behavioural science approach, and they're telling us that it's completely changing the way they think and how they approach problems of this nature. So I'm going to tell you a little bit before I start about how councils like Liverpool have traditionally tackled problems relating to road safety. So the standard approach that's used relies on three levers of change: education, engineering and enforcement. Now, obviously, engineering and enforcement take a lot more money and time to implement. So what local authorities will tend to do is they'll reach first for information and awareness raising campaigns. And these campaigns can be quite traditional, and they will tend to be designed to inform people of the risks and to persuade them to care about the consequences. However, what the team at Liverpool Council were telling us was that it was getting increasingly obvious to them that creating good intentions and increasing knowledge simply wasn't enough. What they were beginning to realise was that it was perfectly possible for someone to understand the risks and to care about the consequences, but then get into their car or step out onto the road and behave in a way that was the complete opposite of what they now knew and believed to be right. So in 2018, when Liverpool found out that they had the second highest rate of adult pedestrian casualties in the UK, they knew they needed to take a different approach, and they came to us to see if we could help them. Holly.
Hi, thank you very much for inviting us today. One of the first things we did at SOMO was to create a heat map that showed the main risk areas for adult pedestrian casualties in Liverpool. As you'd expect, there is a large cluster of collisions concentrated in the city centre, but we're not going to talk about those today. Instead, we are going to focus on a second and we think intriguing problem area. It's actually several areas situated on the outskirts of the city centre. Our analysis revealed that if you are an adult pedestrian in Liverpool, you are far more likely to be injured in one of these topographies than in any other context. So what do we learn about these sites? Well, they all tended to have several shared common features. Firstly, the collisions mostly occurred in the daytime. Secondly, they were all situated on local high streets, which were intersected by 4 lanes of fast-moving traffic. Third, every single one of these locations had a pedestrian crossing available to pedestrians, which appeared to be located on a main pedestrian desire line. But for whatever reason, people in these high-risk environments were electing not to use the very thing designed to keep them safe, the pedestrian crossing.
Thanks. And just to show you how illogical that is, let's have a quick look at a map plotting the site of pedestrian casualties near a crossing in Liverpool. So the blue line you can see in the centre of that segment is the crossing area, and you'll note that no one's being injured actually on the crossing itself. But what we can see are multiple collisions with pedestrians, which are indicated by the green circles and the blue boxes. Now, just to show you how close they were to the crossing site at the time of their injury, we put in some green markers which denote a 30-metre mark. So this has taken over 10 years, but you can see that pedestrians here in one of these high-risk locations are kind of being involved in collisions and are not using the very thing, as Holly said, that's designed to keep them safe. So the other thing that's quite interesting is we also looked at driver behaviour on these sites, and our analysis found that very few drivers were found to be breaking the law. They weren't speeding, they weren't under the influence of drugs or alcohol, so focusing on them would have had a null or negligible effect. So instead, we hypothesised that if we could increase the number of pedestrians who use available crossings in these areas of high risk, we should be able to see a corresponding reduction in the number of adult pedestrian casualties, which is great, but until we understand why this is the case, we won't know how to change it. So we use a diagnostic methodology to try and uncover and to understand problems of this nature. And that applies a framework which begins by probing the available literature and data, and then progressing later onto primary research when we've got quite a good idea about the questions we need to answer. So starting with the data, we were able to identify who was being hit, how, when, where, but by cross-tabulating this with other data sets, such as the indices of multiple deprivation and mosaic, we were also able to profile the levels of education, health, wealth, and lifestyle of pedestrians involved. We then conducted ethnographic research to deepen our understanding of the effect the environment or the context was having on the choices people in these locations did or didn't take. What we found was that people in these locations who are being hit as adult pedestrians tended to live very close to the collision site. And we were also able to determine that these pedestrians were likely to be experiencing very high levels of deprivation, possibly have money worries, quite limited education, and a strong likelihood of poor physical or mental health. So why is that important? Well, you'll have heard a lot today about the two-system thinking model. And just to recap, we know that system one thinking is fast, it's intuitive, it's automatic and effortless, which is great, but it's also rather prone to bias and error. System two, on the other hand, is slow, it's effortful, deliberate, but typically produces a more unbiased and accurate response. So when you and I are well rested, we're in good physical and mental health, we can move fairly effortless between the two systems. However, when our cognitive load is greater, say for example, if we're stressed, if we're tired, if we're hungry, then the amount of cognitive bandwidth available to us decreases. So in turn, that reduces our capacity for the kind of effortful thinking we need to use to run system two processing. So bear with me, because what I'm getting to is, to put it quite simply, people in these locations are less likely to use system two, and they're more likely to rely on system one thinking, which is making them more vulnerable to error, opening them up to the risk of becoming an adult pedestrian casualty. But let's also look at the other aspect of this, because the key thing this is telling us is that going back to those traditional information-based campaigns that local authorities would tend to rely on probably would not have any effect at all. Trying to cram more into an overly loaded cognitive bandwidth is just not going to help.
So the second insight we had actually builds upon the first one. So we think that what we're observing when we see pedestrians move around these sites is an interaction between that fast system one thinking and another type of thinking, goal-oriented thinking. And when both of these are at play, then what people do is they filter out all sensory stimuli except that which aligns with their own goals. And this can result in a phenomenon known as looking but not seeing. Remember, we hypothesized that if we could get people to more often use the crossings available to them in these settings, then there would be fewer adult pedestrian casualties. But we inferred from our primary research that people are goal orientated to get from A to B in the most direct and fast way possible. And they may not believe the crossing is the way. So as a result, the crossing may appear in their line of sight, but they're simply not attending to the fact that it is there. And when we actually went to the area and conducted our own research and asked people to recount their journey, they seldom recalled even seeing the crossing, which tells us that even though these crossings would have been in their line of sight, they simply weren't attending to them. They were looking but not seeing the very thing designed to keep them safe.
But Holly, surely in such high-risk areas, a key goal of pedestrians will be to prioritise and to attend to the very things that would keep them safe, would facilitate safe crossing.
Well, yes, you'd think so. However, we're assuming they are alert to the risk of being hit, but they might not be if they incorrectly perceive the area as low risk.
But again, why would they perceive this area as low risk? You told us before, adult pedestrians in Liverpool are more likely to be injured on one of these typographies than any other context. So come on, that doesn't make sense.
Yeah, but people who live in these areas are not using traffic collision data to inform their risk. Instead, they're conducting a risk assessment based on their own lived experience, where they may never have been hit by a car, and therefore they're underestimating their personal risk. And this leads us on to our third insight, the path well travelled bias, which describes the human bias to incorrectly judge environments that are familiar to them to be low risk. Remember, Nicola told you adult casualties in these areas live locally. These people are less likely to view their own high street as dangerous. So, to sum up, we have a number of behavioural insights that can help us understand a seemingly illogical decision to cross a dangerous road without using the available crossings. People here incorrectly perceive these locations as low risk. They're operating on a kind of sensory autopilot, which is focused on finding the fastest rather than safest route. In this state, they are looking but not seeing the pedestrian crossings in their midst. And given all of these behavioural insights, information and awareness raising campaigns are unlikely to be effective. So when we developed these behavioural insights and showed them to Liverpool Council,
They loved them, didn't they, Holly? They were absolutely fascinated. They'd not done this before.
They're
And
absolutely
I'm going to let
flabbergasted.
you turn off your mic briefly because your dog's going crazy, but we'll carry on.
I know.
What we realised at this point together was that this was having wider national significance. So together with Liverpool City Council, we got ambitious and we applied to the Road Safety Trust for funding to develop and trial 2 nudge-based interventions. And we were successful in receiving the largest research grant ever awarded to a non-academic institution. And we would have loved to have been here today to show you the nudges we created and share the results of those trials. Hello, Bertie. Is he on the agenda? Sorry. So yeah, we would have loved to have shown you these nudges, but we can't. Why? Well, remember, we're in the business of, in this project, working in the physical world. So these are embedded physical nudges that we need to trial in pretty normal conditions in order to accurately measure and determine effect. But because of COVID, we've had to push those trials back to 2021. So we can't share as much as we'd like with you. But what we can do is talk about some of the things that inspired our thinking and helped us think about how we could transfer those behavioural insights we gleaned into actual physical cues and nudges which we could put in the pedestrian environment. So you've all seen the priority boarding signs at the airport, and what they'll successfully confer to the viewer is that there is a faster and better way to board the plane. Everyone in the airport knows that the individual in a faster boarding or a priority boarding queue is likely to get on the plane quicker than someone who isn't and probably have a better experience. So we thought, well, maybe we can do something similar with the crossings, because remember, we need to align them with the pedestrian's goal of getting where they are going in the fastest and best way possible. So if we can achieve this, what we should be able to do is recalibrate their scanning of the environment to include crossings that look like ours. Now, to do this, we need to make those crossings more salient, and we need to find visual cues and nudges that confer a sense of speed, flow, and pedestrian prioritisation. So these are not ours, but these are some things that we consider that all make use of the kind of available space at the public realm that could be in around the crossing. It's also really important to point out that we are not in the business of tricking people. So the visual and auditory cues we use will be matched by an improved crossing experience. We're going to reduce the wait time for pedestrians and then tell them we've done so. What this will do is activate the elaboration likelihood model, pushing that information into system 2, meaning that every time a pedestrian sees one of these crossings, they should hopefully associate it with a better crossing experience, which all sounds great. But this is obviously our best guess. Until we test them, we won't know the full effect of these nudges. And we wanted to test our nudges, not just in Liverpool, but also in Hull. Hull?
So why are we testing in 2 cities? Well, you may have heard of the replicability crisis in behavioural science. The replicability crisis is a concern that the results of prominent behavioural science papers are not replicated when repeated in further studies, that they were false positives, and we want to avoid that. Plus, we're concerned that we could end up solving a problem specific to Liverpool, but our interventions won't be transferable to similar locations. So to get a sense of the scalability of these cost-effective interventions, we plan to deploy these interventions in the same sorts of contexts, but in 2 different cities. And the second city we've chosen is Hull, which is a great match for Liverpool because it has a similar socio-demographic, it has similar road networks, and it also has a shared problem of high adult pedestrian casualties. Okay, Nick.
So we're out of time. So just to tell you very quickly what happens next. Trials are planned for 2021. We'll be sharing those results in 2022. We're publishing in academic journals, conferences, and maybe we'll even be here next year to tell you how we got on. But if, like me, you're impatient, you can go to the SOMO website where we've been blogging our progress as we go. Final thought from me, we also train non-behavioural scientists in this diagnostic behavioural approach. So if you're interested, get in touch. Otherwise, thank you very much for listening and enjoy the rest of your day. And thank you also to Bertie, who joined us at the end.